Well, how is your relationship with them now? You said
It's good. It's a real relationship. It's real. You know, we spend a lot of time together.
For decades, Neil Young has been one of the most unpredictable and uncompromising figures in rock history. From his groundbreaking work with Buffalo Springfield, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, and Crazy Horse, to his sprawling solo career that jumped from folk ballads to roaring grunge anthems, Young has always played by his own rules. Fans and critics alike have long speculated about who truly inspired him, what bands he held closest to his heart, and which musicians helped shape his restless creativity. But Neil has rarely been one to hand out lists or play the game of naming favorites. Until now. In a rare and candid moment, Neil Young opened up about the bands that defined his life, the ones that stirred his imagination, and the groups he keeps returning to even after all these years. These aren't just names tossed out casually. Each of these bands carries a story, a connection, or a moment that left an unforgettable imprint on Neil's journey as both an artist and a human being. And while some of his choices may not surprise die-hard fans, others reveal hidden corners of Neil's musical soul. Influences you might not expect from a man known for his raw, ragged guitar solos and deeply personal songwriting. Together, these 7 bands don't just form a playlist of favorites. They form a map of Neil Young's influences, passions, and the sounds that continue to guide him even in his later years. So which bands made the cut? And what do these choices reveal about Neil Young himself? Let's break it down. When Neil Young began speaking about the bands that shaped his musical journey, he started at the beginning, the artists who planted the earliest seeds of his love for sound, storytelling, and raw expression. For Neil, the foundation was always about honesty in music, and the first 2 bands he named were the Beatles and Buffalo Springfield. It might seem obvious to include the Beatles on any list of greatest bands, but for Neil, their influence ran far deeper than simple admiration. He came of age in Canada during the 1960s, when the entire world was being shaken by the British invasion. The Beatles weren't just another group, they were a cultural earthquake. Neil has often talked about how their daring to evolve with every record gave him courage to never be boxed in as an artist. To him, they were proof that a band could grow, change, and challenge audiences without losing its soul. What struck Neil most was not their fame, but their fearlessness. They started with innocent pop songs and ended up redefining what rock could be, something Neil himself would echo across his long and unpredictable career. But his list quickly took a personal turn with Buffalo Springfield, a band he didn't just admire, but one he helped create. Formed in Los Angeles in 1966, Buffalo Springfield became the launchpad for Neil's career, alongside Stephen Stills, Richie Furay, and others. They only lasted a short time, but the band's mixture of folk, country, and rock laid the groundwork for what would become one of the defining sounds of the late 60s and early 70s. For Neil, Buffalo Springfield was more than just a band. It was his first real family in music. What made Buffalo Springfield one of his favorites wasn't just nostalgia. Neil has always looked back at that band as a time when creativity was pure, unfiltered, and electric. They were young musicians hungry to make their mark, writing songs that captured the turbulence of the times. Their anthem, For What It's Worth, became a protest song of an era, while Neil's own contributions like Mr. Soul showcased his early genius. To Neil, Buffalo Springfield wasn't perfect, but perfection was never the point. It was about energy, risk-taking, and discovering his voice within a collective. In interviews, Neil has admitted that he sometimes had a difficult relationship with the band, especially with Stephen Stills, but he has never denied the importance of what they achieved together. Even decades later, Neil considers Buffalo Springfield one of the groups that taught him the most about collaboration, songwriting, and the courage to push boundaries. These first 2 choices reveal a lot about Neil Young's heart as a musician. With the Beatles, he found the spark of artistic bravery, a model of how to constantly evolve without fear. With Buffalo Springfield, he found his roots, a band that gave him his first stage, his first struggles, and his first taste of what it meant to put everything into music. Together, these 2 bands tell us where Neil began, both as a fan and as a creator. They are not just favorites. They are the found after, reflecting on the Beatles and Buffalo Springfield. Neil Young turned his attention to two other bands that carried him through the most transformative years of his career. These weren't just groups he admired from a distance. They were forces that echoed his own restless spirit. Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, and Crazy Horse. First, Crosby, Stills, and Nash, the harmonies, the politics, the vision. When Neil joined them in 1969, the trio was already known for their pristine vocals and socially conscious songwriting. But when Young entered the mix, the group transformed into something far more dynamic. Neil's edgy voice and raw guitar style clashed and blended with their polished harmonies, creating an explosive chemistry. To Neil, CSNY wasn't just a band. It was a battleground of ideas, egos, and sounds. What made CSNY one of Neil's favorite bands was the way they captured the spirit of an era. Together, they sang at Woodstock, provided a soundtrack for the anti-war movement, and proved that music could be both beautiful and politically urgent. Songs like Ohio, which Neil wrote after the Kent State shootings, became rallying cries. For Neil, CSNY represented the power of music as activism, proof that a song could move hearts and challenge authority all at once. It was never easy. The infighting within the group was legendary. But Neil always respected the magic they created when they were at their best. Then came Crazy Horse, the band most closely tied to Neil's identity as a solo artist. If CSNY was about harmony and politics, Crazy Horse was about raw, unfiltered emotion. Their collaborations produced some of Neil's most iconic albums, including Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere and Rust Never Sleeps. With Crazy Horse, Neil found the perfect foil for his restless creativity. They weren't virtuosos in the traditional sense, they weren't flashy or technically polished, but they had a looseness, a grit, and a willingness to follow Neil wherever his muse led. To Neil, Crazy Horse wasn't just a backup band. They were co-conspirators. Their ragged sound gave his music a sense of danger, of imperfection that made it feel alive. Songs like Cinnamon Girl and Like a Hurricane showcased their ability to channel Neil's vision into thunderous, unforgettable performances. For Neil, Crazy Horse embodied the idea that music didn't need to be perfect to be powerful. In fact, the cracks, the chaos, the unpredictability, that's where the truth lived. What makes these two bands stand out among Neil's favorites is how they reflect the dual sides of his artistic soul. With CSNY, he tapped into beauty, harmony, and the political urgency of the late 60s and 70s. With Crazy Horse, he unleashed his primal electric side, creating music that was raw, unapologetic, and timeless. Both bands pushed him, challenged him, and allowed him to express himself in completely different ways. Together, they also highlight Neil's refusal to ever be pinned down. He could stand in a circle with three of the finest vocalists of their time and deliver perfect harmonies one moment, then turn around and blast out feedback-drenched guitar solos with Crazy Horse the next. Few artists in history have managed that kind of range, and Neil's choice of these two bands makes it clear why. They weren't just favorites. They were essential to his evolution. In naming CSNY and Crazy Horse among his 7 favorite bands, Neil wasn't just reminiscing about past glories. He was reminding the world that music, at its best, is about tension, collaboration, and the courage to embrace both harmony and chaos. Ian Stones of a career that would go on to defy expectation after expectation. When Neil Young revealed his list of favorite bands, some names were predictable, the ones closely tied to his own history and legacy. But then came a pair of choices that made fans raise their eyebrows: Pearl Jam and the Rolling Stones. Both bands represented sides of Neil's musical personality that weren't always obvious, yet both played crucial roles in shaping how he thought about music and performance. Let's start with Pearl Jam. For many, it might have seemed unusual that a band born out of the grunge explosion of the 1990s would rank so highly on Neil's list. But when you look deeper, the connection is obvious. Neil admired Pearl Jam because they carried the torch of raw, uncompromising rock and roll at a time when the genre desperately needed it. Their energy, their passion, and especially Eddie Vedder's commanding voice resonated with Neil. In fact, Neil's bond with Pearl Jam wasn't just admiration from afar. They collaborated in the mid-1990s, recording Mirror Ball together in 1995. That album was a collision of two generations. Neil, the godfather of grunge, and Pearl Jam, the torchbearers of the new era. The sessions were famously chaotic and electrifying, with Neil praising the band's fearlessness and spontaneity. For Neil, Pearl Jam proved that the spirit of rock was still alive, carried forward by musicians who weren't afraid to follow their instincts, no matter what the industry demanded. Including them on his list was his way of acknowledging not just influence, but kinship. Then there were the Rolling Stones, a band Neil has spoken about with both admiration and honesty. While he has often been compared to Bob Dylan for his songwriting, it was the Stones who taught him about swagger, attitude, and the sheer joy of rock and roll. Neil respected their ability to endure decade after decade, constantly reinventing themselves while staying true to their rebellious core. What struck Neil most about the Stones was their ability to turn grit into glory. Unlike the Beatles, who evolved in leaps of artistry, the Stones were raw from the beginning, driven by blues, attitude, and unapologetic energy. For Neil, they represented another kind of honesty in music. Not introspection, but the guts to put yourself on stage night after night and give everything to the crowd. He admired how Keith Richards and Mick Jagger built a musical empire not through polish, but through persistence and a relentless belief in their sound. Fans who know Neil's work could see those influences woven into his music. His live shows often carried the same ragged, unpredictable energy as a Stones concert, while his collaborations with Pearl Jam reminded the world that Neil was never a relic of the past. He was always listening, always engaging with new sounds, always pushing himself into new territory. By naming Pearl Jam and the Rolling Stones, Neil revealed something essential about himself: that he has always been a bridge between generations. He could look backward with reverence and forward with curiosity, drawing inspiration from both the legends who came before him and the rebels who came after. These two choices weren't just about personal taste. They were about Neil staking his claim as a lifelong student of rock and roll, someone who saw himself as part of an ongoing conversation rather than the final word. Together, Pearl Jam and the Rolling Stones painted a picture of Neil Young as both mentor and fan, a man unafraid to embrace influences from unexpected places, and a reminder that the heartbeat of rock has always been, and always will be, about passion, courage, and defiance. As Neil Young revealed the last name on his list of favorite bands, fans quickly realized it was the perfect way to complete the picture of who he is as an artist: the Grateful Dead. For some, it may have seemed predictable. Two countercultural icons of the 1960s whose paths crossed countless times. But for Neil, the Dead weren't just contemporaries. They represented a spirit, a freedom, and a way of approaching music that resonated deeply with his own philosophy. The Grateful Dead were never about chasing hits or mainstream approval. They thrived in the margins, building one of the most loyal fan communities in music history. To Neil, that sense of independence was everything. Like him, they followed their instincts, even when it meant confusing critics or frustrating record labels. They were outsiders who became legends precisely because they refused to play by the rules. Neil respected that immensely. It mirrored his own career of sharp turns, left-field experiments, and stubborn devotion to doing things his way. Musically, Neil admired the way the Dead approached performance. Their concerts weren't scripted events, but living, breathing explorations. Each show was unique, built on improvisation, risk-taking, and trust between musicians. Neil himself had always preferred the raw, unpredictable energy of live music over polished studio perfection, and in the Dead, he saw kindred spirits. He once described their music as alive in the moment, a phrase that could just as easily describe his own ragged, electrifying shows with Crazy Horse. There was also a personal connection. Neil crossed paths with the Grateful Dead many times, at festivals, benefits, and impromptu jam sessions. While their styles weren't identical, there was always mutual respect. Neil admired Jerry Garcia's ability to blend vulnerability with virtuosity, and Garcia, in turn, saw Neil as a kindred rebel. Their friendship was never about publicity. It was about a shared understanding of what music could be when freed from commercial constraints. By placing the Grateful Dead on his list, Neil wasn't just acknowledging another band he admired. He was sending a message about his values. Every group he named, from the Beatles to Pearl Jam, from Buffalo Springfield to the Stones, had something in common. They were fearless. They weren't afraid to take risks, to change course, to upset expectations. They created music not to please others, but because they believed in what they were doing. And in that sense, the Dead were the ultimate example. Looking at Neil's full list of 7 favorite bands, the Beatles, Buffalo Springfield, Crosby, Stills and Nash, and Young, Crazy Horse, Pearl Jam, the Rolling Stones, and the Grateful Dead, we see a roadmap of his own life and career. The Beatles taught him artistic evolution. Buffalo Springfield gave him his first voice. CSNY connected him to harmony and activism. Crazy Horse let him unleash raw chaos. Pearl Jam reminded him that rock's spirit was still alive. The Stones showed him grit and survival. And the Grateful Dead embodied freedom and community. Together, these choices don't just reveal who Neil Young admires. They reveal who Neil Young is. He has always been a man who straddles worlds, folk and rock, past and future, harmony and noise, solitude and community. His list reflects that duality, that constant tension between the polished and the ragged, the famous and the forgotten, the timeless and the fleeting. For fans, hearing Neil finally name his 7 favorite bands was like getting a glimpse into the heart of his own music. It reminded us that even legends are shaped by those who came before them, and that influence is less about imitation and more about shared spirit. Neil Young has always carved his own path, but he has never walked it alone. These 7 bands were his companions, his rivals, his teachers, and his friends. And maybe that's the final lesson Neil left us with, that music is a conversation across generations. His list wasn't just about who he admired. It was about carrying forward a flame that still burns brightly, proving that rock and roll is, and always will be, about truth.